Hello there. This is Devin Price back at you again with another video version of one of my Substack essays where I read it out loud to you, provide descriptions of the images, and then dive into the comments a little bit to see what people have been saying so far on the writing, just to all make it a little bit more accessible to folks. Today's piece is about why I used to hate children. It is part of an ongoing series on my Substack this month focused on family abolition and child liberation. And I wanted to talk about a really major barrier that I had in adopting these kinds of politics, and that's that I used to really dislike kids. I used to really say that I was a child hater. If I was in a public space and a child was having a tantrum or just being chaotic, doing things that kids would do, I would kind of cringe and feel uncomfortable around them. I would say to people that I hated kids and almost treat it as foolish or selfish for a person to have kids. And it was this very individualistic politics, right, that was very focused on people making the right responsible decisions with their lives and never consuming more than they needed and never weighing myself down by having children. It was a very cruel outlook on the world. But I didn't only have this point of view because I was some cruel, evil person. There were structural reasons for it. And there are many reasons why things like the really hostile flavor of the child-free movement exist and why people engage in that kind of rhetoric and feel disgusted with kids. That has some political potential to dive into. So I wanted to read the piece, delve into it, share a little bit about my own experience of feeling in those ways, and hopefully some of the reasons that I used to have for hating kids are reasons that many of you might also relate to and speak to similar struggles that we have as disabled people, as feminists, as believers in body autonomy, and lots of other different things, as leftists, and so on and so forth. So I'll switch to my screen share, my ugly screen share mode real quick, and fire up this essay. And let's dive right on into it. Why I used to hate kids and what those feelings actually meant. Here is a stock photo of a young white child, either screaming or just hollering exuberantly. She's in the cold, so her face is kind of flushed. She has a few little crumbs on her face, the way kids who are small toddlers tend to do. And she has a winter coat on, a bright pink puffer coat, and a yellow hat. And that's an image by Bart Kurzweil, courtesy of Unsplash. It is Child Liberation Month here on my blog, where we've been talking a lot about abolishing the family as a system that owns children, abolishing age as a determinant of who gets to have rights, and the need for us all to take on the collective responsibility of looking after children. We've also been exploring some of the common barriers that keep people from taking child liberation seriously. And this paragraph links to several other essays that I've written on the topic, and they're also all available as video versions here on YouTube. I wanted to talk a little bit about one factor that kept me from exploring child liberation for many years. I used to hate kids. A lot. Of course, I didn't really hate children. How could I? I hadn't met the majority of them. Hating an entire demographic of human beings is either a projection of your actual feelings about something else, or it's overt bigotry that's indistinguishable from eugenics. A person cannot really hate all old people, for instance, but they can be bitter about the fact that a small subset of predominantly white, middle-class boomers from the imperial core reaped the benefits of capitalism and lived comfortably without much effort, while they personally did not, and have that bitterness warped into a misguided belief that the only act of justice needed is for all of the boomers to die. It's not a humane or even remotely realistic view on politics to generalize a whole age group in this way, but it does make just enough emotional sense that it can take deep roots within a person's psyche and, if left unquestioned, keep them from connecting with the millions of poor, struggling, and minoritized elders who are very much like themselves. When I was a younger man, I hated both older people and children for a lot of the same reasons. I believed that human progress moved in a simple line, forever upward, and that technology and education only ever advanced. How convenient it was that I was living in the most socially progressive and informed era yet in history, which had uniquely equipped me, specifically, to know better than anybody who had come before, and to have so much freedom. My elders were obsolete troglodytes preventing the new world from being born, I thought, and any children that I could have would be nothing but dead weight that prevented me from thinking all the big, important thoughts that I needed to think so that I could carry progress forward and make the world an even better place. The only solution was to live as an island, caring for no one who had insulted my productive, hungry youth by being physically weak or having caretaking needs. It was an incredibly individualistic, selfish understanding of the world. What can I say? I was a libertarian. It took receiving the care of a lot of other people, often care that I actively resisted, for me to realize that I was not fully independent. Nor was anybody else. I hated children with a fervor because of what the cultural symbol of the child meant to me, not because of anything that any actual children had done. Because children are used as a tool for reproducing society, anything to do with children is handled in an especially conservative and traditionalist way in our culture. No matter how much freedom an adult might otherwise have to live and be as they like, their options are far more restricted once they are near children. They're not permitted to wear certain clothing that's seen as too sexual, to love multiple committed partners, to use illicit substances, to stop working, or to challenge too many norms, if they wish to be trusted around kids. In this way, the symbol of the child is used to control people, particularly women, and to reign whatever freedom in society they have managed to find. That was what I hated when I was a young, child-free person who insisted I hated kids. Kids came with the obligation to keep my life tidy, contained, and respectable. Being near them meant enduring constant corrections for my own deviance, and being steadily coerced into a life that hurt me. Over time, I came to loathe being around any children because this is what they represented to me. Compulsory caregiving. When I was a child, people thought I was a girl, and so they thought I should be naturally talented at looking after kids. Neighbors volunteered me for babysitting jobs, then found it confusing when I was ungrateful for the work and performed it poorly. I was shunted into unpaid childcare work at my church, rather than getting to choose to focus on Bible studies or performing in church plays, which I would have preferred. Throughout my youth, adults spoke to me about all the children that I would have and how I would raise them. When I said that I wasn't sure I even wanted children, it didn't compute, and they completely ignored me. Everything that I was taught about sex and the functioning of my own body was centered around the obligation to have kids. This continued on into my early adult life as a straight woman. Every boyfriend and his parents would coo at me about what a wonderful mom I would make one day. Whenever I did say I didn't want to become a mother, people would become angry with me and to demand to know how I thought society was supposed to continue if nobody had children. But I hadn't said that nobody should have children. I just didn't want to do it. Unfortunately, the role of woman as caregiver was so deeply ingrained in people's minds that they couldn't handle hearing a woman question it, or even look at it as a choice. With time, I came to strongly resent kids, because they symbolized to me the expectation that I take on a parenting role and devote my life to someone else's desires rather than my own. I believed that if I projected an irate attitude toward children, nobody would tell me that I'd make a great mom, and I could be free to be whatever I wanted. Dysphoric childbirthing expectations. Part of my distaste toward children came from a visceral disgust with pregnancy. I had always found my body's reproductive capacity frightening. I hated all the talk of ovulation and periods and how hormones supposedly made a person like me irrational. I hated the weight of my breasts and the prominence of them and the creepy messages I received that this part of my anatomy did not really belong to me. It was only there for feeding kids. It seemed outrageous to me that so many people would willingly take on the pain of childbirth and all the potential for bodily damage that came with it. Even worse, it alarmed me just how many women went into pregnancy having never been informed about what the experience would truly be like. When I asked questions about the husband stitch, or the massive amounts of bleeding that happen after delivery, or the potential loss of pelvic floor control, the women in my life dismissed me angrily because I seemed to be challenging the decisions they'd made for their lives. They would swear up and down that having children was worth it, and so I shouldn't question, or even openly discuss, what was required to bring them into the world. A child's life was so important to others that my body autonomy and informed consent did not matter, and I hated kids for it. Conservatism in child rearing. Whenever I did try to interact with children, everyone around me claimed I was doing it wrong. Usually my big mistake was being too honest with children about the ways of the world, or failing to filter the details of my own life to make it traditionally family-friendly. From this, I received the message that I was not an appropriate person for children to be near, and that a life around children would require fundamentally changing who I was. I remember that during a Christmas party when I was about 20, my 10 and 8-year-old cousins were excitedly bouncing around me, lobbing questions about all the ways in which people might die. What would happen to somebody's body if they were thrown into a volcano? What happened to a person if they took too many drugs? I loved their curiosity and tried to give them my best answers, which made my cousins scream with scandalized delight. Then an adult relative pulled me away and said that I couldn't say such things to little kids. I had no idea how else to interact with them, and all they wanted was for me to keep giving them the candor that they found so refreshing. And so I sat down on the couch, my lips zipped, and my young cousins slunk boredly away back to their rooms. At any family gatherings that included children, I had to be coy about my life. If a younger relative asked whether I had a boyfriend, I could not tell the truth and list multiple partners. I couldn't say I was unmarried and lived with a partner. I couldn't say anything cynical about the government or my job. Interacting appropriately with children meant reining in every remotely controversial detail about my life and not ever being emotionally honest. Oh geez, my cat is sitting on my mouse right here, so I had to move it. Rather than hating the adults around me for their judgment and their refusal to be candid with kids, I came to hate the repressed, judged feeling that I got when I was around kids. Ableism and neuronormativity in child rearing. Other adults never liked the way that I spoke to children. I spoke to kids like fellow human beings, with the exact same tone of voice that I used for anybody else, and I wouldn't shy away from using larger words. But whenever I did any of these things, some other adult would interrupt me to say that was not the way to speak to a child, then address the kid in a lilting baby voice with overly simplified language. If I tried talking to a child in depth about their interests or share in an observation about something that was happening in the world around us, an adult would interrupt me to say that their kid didn't care about things like that. I was making the conversation too serious and complex. Conversations with children were supposed to be limited to brief comments about their appearance, evaluations of their behavior, instructions, and occasionally superficial remarks about the child's interests that didn't last longer than a minute or two. Anything beyond that was strange, too much for a child to process, and far more respect than they were owed. I think many adults genuinely found it dangerous that I would speak with a child as if they were a whole person. A lifetime of such corrections left me believing that I was incompetent at interacting with children, when really I had just committed the sin of being a weird autistic person who respected kids. I stopped trusting myself to know how to interact and started fearing that I was creepy and inept. And so I came to hate any moment that I was put in the same room as a child, because it was a social test I knew I wasn't able to pass and would only be punished for attempting. This stock photo, I keep returning to picnic imagery. There's a lot of family picnic images when you look for families and kids on stock photo sites. So this is a black family on a picnic blanket in the park. A adult man and an adult woman talking to one another, and then a maybe younger teen girl, maybe a tween, sitting on the blanket with her arm on the blanket and her face in her hands, and she's looking at a Connect 4 board with kind of a bored or daydreamy expression. And this image is by John Amichab on Unsplash. Lack of freedom. Like so many neurodivergent and queer people, I was punished for being too weird and difficult when I was a child. But as an adult, I finally had the freedom to live as I liked, covering my body in piercings and tattoos, trying whatever drugs that I wanted, eating how I wanted and on my own schedule, sleeping chaotically, partying, having sex, quitting jobs, and traveling at my own whims. I could even be rude if I thought the situation deserved it, or break laws with which I disagreed. I had freedoms that no children do, to decide what I believed in, what mattered to me, and whether I would live differently from what I'd been taught was right. None of this would have been permitted if I was responsible for children, though. Being an openly sexual, unpredictable, unruly, drug-using parent was the kind of thing that got someone socially ostracized or even locked up. I never wanted to lose the freedom to be myself again, the freedom that all children, unfortunately, lack. And so, it seemed, I'd have to live as far away as possible from kids. Rather than recognizing children as prisoners, I viewed them as the shackle that would keep me tied to a home, a job, and a conformist life that would only destroy who I really was. Here I've included a link to the song My Baby Wants a Baby by St. Vincent, and it's a lovely song off of her Daddy's Home album, all about the inner conflict she feels knowing that her partner wants to have a child. And she really longs for independence and for a kind of rock star, unshackled life. But she's also thinking about her long-term legacy and how she'll be known, whether she'll be able to continue making art, whether she would be defined by being a mother if she were to have a kid, and how to reconcile all of these fears with the fact that she does really, really deeply love her partner and what her partner wants out of her own life as well. And I've included the lyric here from this song. I want to play guitar all day, eat all my meals from microwaves, only dress up if I get paid. How can it be wrong? Wrong. Really lovely song, and we've recently found out, since she won the Grammy for a subsequent album, that St. Vincent has had a child with her partner. So, let's go lesbians. Financial and logistical burden. The society that I live in provides very few resources to people who raise kids. For the most part, children live in isolated nuclear families where only one or two caregivers have to handle generating an income, completing chores, providing food and shelter, and performing all childcare completely by themselves. For the average American family, the burden of all of this is already staggering, but if any of their children are disabled, it becomes insurmountable. There is never enough time or money, never enough hands on deck. I knew that I didn't have what it would take to raise a child adequately on my own, and that I would be angry when things started to break down. Though I had enjoyed interacting with children once upon a time, I'd never had the energy required to work a full-time job, commute, and look after myself, let alone to keep young people bathed, fed, and educated. I needed lots of time in the dark and quiet to recover my energy, or else I would completely shut down. I could not be trusted to complete mountains of paperwork. How could I ever take on the needs of a child? In this world, with its socially constructed family and its lack of external supports, playing a role in a child's life is an all-or-nothing deal. Either you contribute everything that you've got to a kid that is yours, or you can't play much of a role in kids' lives at all. I could have made an excellent part-time babysitter, but instead of viewing children as friends and neighbors who I could show up for graciously whenever I was able, I came to see them as a heavy obligation I could never stand. Coercive gendering. When there are children in your life, you can't escape society's unrelenting and coercive gendering of everything. The doctors assign your kid a sex, whether you'd like them to or not. And it comes with all kinds of assumptions and pastel-colored gifts that signal the type of person everyone thinks your kid should become. The clubs and activities are gendered, the toys are gendered, the parenting roles are gendered, the way people speak to your child are gendered. The entire world is absolutely fixated on whether the child is a girl or a boy. And if you do anything to resist this, you're viewed as an annoying activist pushing their beliefs onto kids or a perverted abuser. As a transgender person, I was very negatively affected by all the ways that gender was pushed on the younger me. I have an instinctive revulsion toward mainstream parenting and childcare spaces because of this. It's all awash in the pastel blues and pinks of a reactionary, binary gender ideology that finds my existence threatening. As gender variant people like me have become more visible, parenting norms have in turn become more gender essentialist. Gender reveal parties weren't a big thing until after the transgender tipping point happened. The way that people insistently gender their infants and kids reflects a hatred of people like me. I have had to work hard to build a life for myself that is removed from all this compulsive gendering. I live in a small pocket of queer and trans people who accept me for who I am and question most of the boxes that society puts people in. But if I were to ever have a child or bring children more closely into my life, I would be surrounded by people who equate a kid's body with their identity all over again. Institutional control. When you have children, you are required to interact with a great number of bureaucratic systems, and your life is more closely regulated by the law. From the moment a child is born, you must log their existence with the state and declare who you are to them and who their other parent is. This ties you to a co-parent for the next 18 years of the kid's life, no matter how dysfunctional or abusive that relationship becomes. In a messy custody battle, you may even lose control of where you're allowed to live. As a parent, you must enroll your child in school, where both you and the child will be closely monitored. And if anything seems unusual about how either of you look and behave, you might be thrown in prison or lose access to your kid. Anything from affirming your trans kid's gender, to raising them vegan, to giving them an unusual name, can cause your child to be taken away. If you are polyamorous, queer, or kinky, your neighbors might report you for child abuse, and you might lose custody. As a person who has always feared institutional control, I have never wanted to subject myself to the degree of scrutiny that parenthood requires. And I've sometimes mistakenly thought that I hated kids for threatening to restrict my own freedoms. Abuse and neglect. Sometimes we come to hate children because they remind us of the horrific experiences we endured at their age. Seeing how vulnerable and fragile a young child really is can make some people with abuse histories emotionally regress. Or it can make them confront just how moldable their young minds were when the abuse was happening. When I think back on my own abuse history in abstract terms, the person that I see is me, as I am today. But when I look at an actual 5-year-old and really confront what it would be like for them to be inappropriately touched or screamed at, the reality is far more terrifying. Trauma can make even being around children triggering. And for me, I sometimes mistook this reaction for a hatred toward kids. Early childhood trauma can morph into quite unsettling shapes inside of us. It's not uncommon for survivors to feel resentment when they see young children receiving the care that they never got. Some survivors feel that they can never become parents because they don't know what a healthy relationship between an adult and a child looks like, and they fear that their histories have tainted them and made them an abuser. I've had a lot of these feelings swirling around in me over the years. I felt so certain that if a child ever relied upon me, I would be short-tempered and emotionally absent. I wouldn't have enough to give and would hate them for demanding so much. I was sure that my father's words would come tumbling out of me when I was around them, making inappropriate comments that would scar the child for life, as I had been scarred. It didn't help that all my life people had told me I did not know how to properly interact with children, that I lacked the nurturing instinct that I was supposed to have, that I didn't want what I had been expected to want without question, that I didn't have what it took to keep a kid healthy, that there were fundamental things about me that were unsettling and dangerous for a child to ever see. I hated children for all the reasons that society had made me hate myself. Everything about me that was weak, unreliable, strange, loud, incapable of reading the room, disagreeable, ugly, messy, impulsive, and inconsiderate was childish. And I wanted to cut myself off from anything that made me feel those ways. But the more that I denied those aspects of myself, the larger the fear of them loomed. My weakness and need kept leaking out, and I never stopped feeling like a child in society's eyes. Not so much a person as a burdensome problem to be contained and managed. The only way to move past it, and to stop hating myself, was to stop hating the figure of the child. That is the piece. I've included a link here to the piece that kicked off this whole month of content, Interact with Minors, Against the Collective Neglect of the Young. You can read it on Substack, or you can watch the video version on here. I'll dive into the comments really quick because there are a few good messages that people have left about some of this stuff. Okay, the first comment that I want to highlight comes from Victor. I can't help but notice how much it ties with navigating the world as a disabled person that is useless. Like, I can heavily relate to children and the way they can trigger resentment in people. I have experiences of triggering resentment by existing as someone disabled around people who were not emotionally mature enough to not make me feel like a burden forced to carry. I don't know. I just think it's interesting how children and certain disabled people can be treated and viewed similarly, with lack of seeing human in the other person. And instead, how you said, but instead of viewing children as friends and neighbors, whom I could show up for graciously whenever I was able, I came to see them as a heavy obligation I could never stand. Being treated as a heavy obligation is really traumatizing. Thank you for sharing this topic with others and discussing it so honestly and openly. In my experience, the more I worked with my childhood trauma, the better and more sensitive I became to children, just as I've become better in my mind to the past child me. Absolutely. Thank you, Victor. Disabled people are infantilized. They are equated with children. And in disability justice spaces, we talk about that a lot, but not enough people go past that and say, well, why the hell do we even treat children like that in the first place? The disregard that we have for children and their rights, the well-being of their bodies, the disgust we feel with how much they need, it all reflects a very subjugating, capitalistic mindset of human life. It's very uncompassionate, and it has no patience for the fact that we all are going to need support. We have all needed support, and we're all going to need support, and there are going to always be people who are not going to be able to give as much physical labor, work, time, attention as they require to receive. And so if we're defining the value of a life based on how much someone gives to other people, we're going to be treating a huge segment of the population, including all people at the beginning and end of their lives, as disposable. It's not sustainable. Humans do not exist to be productive and to constantly generate more output or revenue. We are literally just here. We are just animals trying to survive. And to survive, we have to do what other animals often do, which is look after our youth and our elders and focus on listening to our bodies and looking after our bodies and their needs, not trying to do anything additional on top of that. Anything additional that comes beyond that is like gravy. Unfortunately, human society is so oriented around just squeezing the most value out of labor as possible and out of the earth and out of the environment and other animals that we have just no culturally ingrained respect for what living things actually need. And we don't really hold on to the idea, at least in, Western white society that I'm speaking from, that life by itself is enough. That life just is and should be supported and accepted, even if it never profits you or helps you out in any way. And so the attitudes that we have towards disabled people come from our hatred toward children, elders, and any other, what did RFK call it? Like unproductive eaters or whatever awful eugenicist phrase. Like this logic inherently heads to a eugenicist place because you're saying that a life that requires support is worth less than a life that generates revenue. And that is an inherently objectifying, dehumanizing way to look at things. Let's see. There was another comment I wanted to highlight. From Cleo Bricks. The dysphoria comes from the opposing direction. Seeing children hurts because I can't have them, even though I probably wouldn't if I could, but then it would be my decision at least, which is closely tied up with how society at large views women who can't reproduce on one hand, and the fact pretty much everyone will see you as a gross sex pervert for even wanting it on the other hand. Thank you, Cleo. Other trans femme writers who I admire, like Trans Peaks, she's spoken about that extensively here as well. There's so many ways in which trans women are left out of conversations about reproductive freedom, and it's seen as a frivolity, even within feminist spaces. So I just always want to highlight that in a world with reproductive justice, trans women would have as many resources as they need to have children the way they want to have on their own terms, just as much as any cis woman deserves to have those things and often can find support. Certainly we're not living in a reproductively just world, but there are systems in place and lots of nonprofits and political movements that are devoted to reproductive justice for cis women, and trans women get crickets. And when they do speak about wanting to have a child, it's seen as perverted by people. So this is definitely a sword that cuts in two different directions here. Equating womanhood with having children does so much to invalidate trans women, and that right is denied trans women as a way of denying their womanhood. And then for trans masc people, a lot of times it's a big source of dysphoria, the expectation that we'll have kids. Let's see, what else? Cassie says, the hardest part of being a parent, especially for me as an autistic queer poly parent, is the system, the doctor, the government, the school system. They all assume you also see your kid as property. And when you don't assist them, or God forbid respect your child, you are labeled an enemy. The second hardest part is people who love taking out their hatred of the very valid points in this article out on parents and children. Really love how in all of these articles this month you've outlined how it is literally mutual aid and community care to support children and families, but not the structure of family as we know it. You know what I mean. Yes, people who are child-free are also incredibly hostile to parents. And as much as our society is fixated on the reproduction of society through kids, they don't care about parents. They don't provide resources to parents. They don't especially provide resources to parents of disabled kids. And I think it's really important for us as child liberationists and disability justice-minded folks to remain cognizant of that, because sometimes we demonize parents who have made bad decisions because they didn't have enough resources. The autism mommy type figure, we've certainly spoken about before on this blog. When people are pushed that much to the brink, they often do lash out or try to meet their needs in really incomplete ways. And if you're the child of a parent who treated you in that way, of course, you are entitled to feel however you want to feel about that parent. But in terms of how do we prevent that kind of stuff from happening in the world in the future, well, then we need to have a real conversation about supporting those families rather than demonizing individual parents for behaving badly or for even being abusive. Because there are people who latch onto the power they have over their children and exploit that. But the solution to that is liberating children and also providing really abundant resources for them and their families. MQ says, I have a ton of childhood trauma, and every stage of my kid's life has been about trying to unpack what that age was like for me, despite decades of therapy before having kids, while remaining present for him. I don't always get it right, but I also think that's one of the gifts of parenthood. It killed what was left of my extreme perfectionism because it is totally impossible to be a perfect parent. I wrote about this in Laziness Does Not Exist, but in the developmental psych literature, we have this concept of the good enough parent, and that is really what kids psychologically need. They don't need the perfect parent. In fact, kids learn from having parents who make mistakes and can acknowledge them. That itself is a real gift, and it's something that comes up in a lot of questions that I get from parents of autistic kids, most of whom are autistic themselves. They really don't know what to make of the fact that sometimes they're going to falter and sometimes their kid's going to still be mistreated. They're not going to be the perfect advocate all the time. Their kid is still going to encounter ableism. And something that I hammer home to parents who ask that kind of thing again and again is that you can't expect yourself to do and be it all. That entire model of parenting is not realistic. What you can do is you can level with your kid about the fact that the world is unfair, that you don't have enough support, that there is prejudice that you and your kid are going to be facing, and that they shouldn't have to endure it, but they do, and that it hurts, and that you feel like a failure sometimes. And you can really sit in those hard feelings together and work through them. It's not the end of the world to admit to those things or for those things to happen. That's part of how you develop psychological resilience over time, is being able to really sit in those failures and mistakes and limitations and have some grace for yourself and others. So, that's something that comes up a lot, because I know a lot of readers are parents who are themselves neurodivergent and they want to spare their kids the mistreatment they endured. And it's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's not entirely possible. You are doing things differently. You are armed with different knowledge than your parents had, but raising your kid in this perfect bubble where they're not going to suffer is not the goal. You want to equip them to exist in this awful, unjust world, to see it as it is, to see that it's unfair, to know it's not them, and to be able to talk about how that affects them with other people who are affected by it too. So a bit of a tangent there, but something that comes up a lot in a lot of my writing, so I wanted to highlight it. So that is the piece. There's some other great comments in the comment section. There's more that popped up while I was reading this that I'm going to dive into and take a look at. But thank you so much to everyone who has been listening and watching these video versions. I've really enjoyed the positive response that it's been getting. I still have the intention of recording some of my greatest hits from my blog in video format in the next several weeks and months. So subscribe and hang out if you want to see that. And you can always get my work delivered to your inbox at drdevinprice.substack.com. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for all of the wonderful things you've had to share. And let me know what you think about this new cadence that I've been unveiling of shorter work more frequently, I've been finding it's a lot better for me and less stressful and more energizing and exciting. I get to have a lot more conversations about stuff. I usually have too many words, not too few. So let me know what you think about this format. If you have any questions, the next month I think is going to be mostly an autistic advice block of lots of autistic advice questions. So go on ahead and submit some of those advice questions to me, whether it's about sex, parenting, autism, ADHD, whatever else. I'll be diving into that mailbag and posting some articles responding to people's questions. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you around next time.